in the last video, we were talking about Lincoln, and we were talking about, you know, the South was, we've hit some pivotal points, and the tide is starting to turn, and South is not, is starting to really kind of struggle. And this is at the point in the war when Lincoln's like, you know, he's very frustrated these few years, you know, even though the South has won a lot of battles, they're, you know, the North is slowly making headway, especially with that Anaconda Plan. And Lincoln's like, you know, this is just, you know, we gotta figure out how to end this war. And his approach was, if I emancipate the slaves, then they can help, and there'll really be a push for the North to win the war. So Lincoln emancipates. And he creates a document, a declaration, that says all of the slaves in the southern states are free. Now the interesting point in this is there were three border states, that were slave states that stayed in the Union, that did not secede. And they still, under the Emancipation Proclamation, still had the legal right to keep their slaves, as opposed to their southern states that left and seceded. As soon as that happened, many African Americans at that point, they were not allowed to be, especially in the Union Army, and now that changed too with emancipation, and it was decided, well, they can come and fight. That was the reason for it. Let's get more fighting, and you know, they see that affinity, and the war will end quickly. And so this is a recruiting poster for African Americans to come join the fight. And with the Emancipation Proclamation, all of a sudden, Lincoln did that to help preserve the Union. But it really shifted the focus of, we have to stop these southern states from leaving the Union, from seceding, to putting the focus of the war on slavery. And so, even though Lincoln's ultimate motivation was to keep the Union, he thought, well, if I have to free the slaves to keep the Union, it was a way for him to get what he wanted, I'll do that. One of the most famous black regiments was the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and they were very well known for their distinguished fighting. There's a movie about it, but we'll talk about that later. And you saw how black troops really, a lot of times with the Union, even though they were allowed to serve, they held different positions. They weren't necessarily on the fighting front. They would be the cooks and other things. And so here is a poster of black troops freeing the slaves. And kind of imagine what that would be like for freed northern black troops to free some African Americans. The emancipation was really the beginning of the end for the South. The war continued to turn bad, and basically it was, so much of that was due to the high attrition rate, or the death rate, and the wounded rate for the southern troops and the northern troops. They really come out about the same, but there were much less men to fight for the South. And by the end of 1863, the North was really beginning to push through the southern states. They were beginning to really close in, and that push was led by General Sherman. And General Sherman's goal was to consume or destroy all enemy resources. Their plan, their goal in all this was like a scorched earth policy. As they marched through, they burned and destroyed everything. They wanted to either take it or destroy it to prevent the Southern Army from using it to end this war. In one of the major battles, one of the significant battles, and really the turning point, the battle that was a turning point for the North, was Gettysburg. Gettysburg is up here in Pennsylvania, and with the northern troops beginning to, especially in the west, get the Mississippi, with the Northern troops beginning to have battles here in Chancellorsville and Virginia and Fredericksburg, the South thought, okay, we got to stop this Northern advance, and so let's really see if we can get the public opinion in the North on our side. And so General Lee thought, well, why don't we take the troops, the Southern Confederate troops, go up north and attack on Northern soil. If the Northerners, if the general public started to see their homeland being attacked, battles happening there, the enthusiasm for the war they felt by the public would wane, and Lincoln would succumb to that. So Lee targets this town of Gettysburg. And as they move through Virginia and parts of Maryland, again, that would redirect the fighting from the south into the north. A Southern general, General Pickett, led 15,000, that would be 15 of our schools, 15,000 Confederate troops across an open field. Anyone going across an open field, it's open season just to kill them, to shoot them. And so the Union did just that. They really just mowed them down as they were marching and advancing. The Union soldiers were stationary, they were dug in, they had their positions, and they were just taking them down. So in Gettysburg, it was a battle of 3 days. It was a horrific, bloody battle. Pickett kept charging, more and more died. It was horrible. And the Confederate Army was essentially defeated, and as they began to retreat to Virginia. Gettysburg is the largest battle. Over 100,000 people died in 3 days. The bloodshed, the fighting was horrific. And because of the enormity of the amount of men lost, Gettysburg was seen as a place where, for both sides, it needed to be memorialized. You don't lose 100,000 Americans. In 9/11, we lost about close to 3,000. Think of 100,000 in 3 days of fighting. American fighting against American. And so Gettysburg has hit a plateau or a place that few other battles have. And so it was the idea of this is, in a sense, holy ground. Many men lost their lives, and we needed to set it apart. And so when they got to Gettysburg, Lincoln was going to give a speech. And you need to understand that back then, when people gave speeches, it was normal and it was considered average that they would speak for an hour, 2 hours, sometimes as much as 3 hours. And so they didn't have movies, they didn't have internet, they had nothing. So if you wanted to get the information besides newspaper or letter, you went and heard a speech. And then for somebody to really explain their position on something, it was not unusual for it to go for a couple hours. So they are at Gettysburg, and they have this famous orator, this famous speaker coming to speak, and President Lincoln was coming to speak. And the orator spoke first. The gentleman spoke first, and he spoke for a couple hours. Lincoln gets up, and he speaks, he speaks for about 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and he speaks these few lines. And then he sat down, and the audience was in shock. They had just sat through a couple hours of hearing someone speak, and they thought, surely the president will speak as long, if not longer. And this is what he said, these few lines. And then he sat down. As he sat down, he was known to have said, well, this is probably going to be the most unrecognized or forgotten speech or position ever. And little did President Lincoln realize it is one of the more famous ones. We will talk a little bit more about Gettysburg and towards the end of the war in the next video.